And for the rest of us, we are going to have just as much fun as children because we'll be opening our Bibles to Genesis chapter 10, which is a sweet genealogy. So, Genesis chapter 10, that's where we'll be, and we'll start. So, before I jump in, Derek mentioned to me that he had offered a reward for those of you who could determine which parts of his sermon last week were him and which parts were me. And he said everyone who came up to him didn't get it. So apparently you don't know us well enough yet. But, or true.
Or you did a really good Derek, and then I did a really good Derek doing Curtis doing Derek.
I don't know what just happened, but I'm ready to get started. So we open this morning with Genesis chapter 10, a genealogy. For those of you who have been reading along through Genesis so far, you are probably aware that this is already our third genealogy in just 10 short chapters. I know how tempting it can be to skirt by these lists of unfamiliar names and hard to pronounce names that just immediately feel so irrelevant to us as modern readers. Right? We'd have a hard time imagining most of our favorite stories stopping right as the action gets going just so the author could give us this extended list of names. But what if genealogies aren't so irrelevant? And what if we actually use them and rely on them often in our lives? So, who comes to mind when I say the name Manning? Right? Not just Peyton, but immediately, maybe some of you who are from Archie, Eli. What about when I say the name Kardashian? Or Kennedy? Right? Likely, each of these names brings to mind not just a single person, but this entire web of persons to your mind. More than that, these names carry with them more than just name associations, but other kinds of associations. To speak of the Kardashians is to speak of entertainment. To talk about the Mannings is to talk about football. To reference the Kennedys is to immediately recognize that we're engaging in some sort of political conversation. And these are the genealogies that we know because they're the genealogies that we've grown up with. They're part of our cultural identity, so much so that we don't even realize the power that one word, a single name has, right? To immediately bring to mind stories and events and people and even ideas and emotions. So let me ask you, what do the names Shem, Ham, and Japheth bring to mind? Oh, thanks, Dina. Are these names, along with the stories that are associated with these names, and the families that come from these names, are they as easy and immediate for us to access as some of our cultural icons are? To be transparent, this is one of the goals of the reading plan that Derek has developed for us through the Torah. The plan gets us reading and rereading Genesis and the scriptures that we'll be in as well, connecting this reading with ongoing discussion in small groups and in our homes so that we can become more and more familiar with these people, with their families, and with their meaning within the story of the Bible. The Kardashians will always mean something to us if entertainment is what we are living for. We'll read up on them. We'll know who is dating whom. We'll know who is pregnant. And it's not just that we'll know these things. We will set out to learn these things. Because these are the things that we care about. And so we'll want to learn about them. Because if we are living our lives vicariously through celebrities and entertainers, then this stuff matters to us. But if we really begin to embrace the idea that the Bible offers us the promise of a different kind of life, an altogether better, though very different kind of life, then while we might be familiar with the Kardashians or the Mannings or the Kennedys because they're a part of the culture that we live in, it is the Shems and the Hams and the Japheths that we're hungry to learn about. If we're interested in the God that reveals himself to us in these pages, then we'll read up. We'll know who is related to whom. We'll know who did what. But we won't just know this stuff automatically. We'll learn it, right? Because God has told us about these people. We'll care deeply about them. And so we'll want to learn these things because if we want to live our lives in sync with the creator of heaven and earth, then this stuff matters. All this to say, as strange as genealogies feel, and they feel strange, we don't use them the way that the Bible uses them, at least not commonly in our lives. I want to encourage you by saying they matter. And they're more than just bonus information to help you win like trivia games about the Bible. We'll see this morning that they actually help tell the story and they move the story forward. So all this talk about genealogies, and you think that this is the only thing we're going to talk about this morning, but the genealogy is just the first part of our passage, and so let's jump into it. If you have your sermon notes with you, you might take a look at those briefly in the worship folder. And you'll notice that chapter 10 has a pretty straightforward outline to it. There's a clear introduction, there's a clear conclusion, and both of these give us some direction as to what's happening in this specific genealogy. The actual list of names has 3 parts to it. One is for each of the sons of Noah. Pretty simple outline. And so our passage is then introduced in verse 1 of chapter 10. And we read, "These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood." These are the generations of the sons of Noah. This feels like maybe one of the most generic and bland introductions of anything ever, right? But in Genesis, it's actually much more than that. And you really start to notice it if you read large chunks of Genesis at one point, because this is actually the 4th time in just 10 chapters that we've heard this phrase introduce a new section. We heard it in chapter 2. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. We heard it, a form of it in chapter 5. This is the book of the generations of Adam. We heard it again in chapter 6. These are the generations of Noah. And now here again, we get this phrase tied to Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It may not be immediately obvious yet, being only 10 chapters into Genesis, but this is actually one of the defining markers, structural markers of the whole book of Genesis. The oldest Hebrew texts of Genesis didn't have chapters. There weren't 50 chapters of Genesis, and there were no verses to orient your reading. But the book of Genesis had 10 introductory phrases. These are the generations of. This phrase introduces each new section of Genesis, which tells us we are in a new section. The generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood. So we get something else here. Note that this time reference specifically links this list of names to the events that have just happened, the events that we heard Derek describe for us last week. Narratively, this introduction is moving our story forward. We are after the flood. But who are these sons? And who are their sons? Japheth is listed in verse 2, first in verse 2. And the book of Genesis is entirely disinterested in Japheth and his sons, other than this one mention of any of them. There are 14 total descendants listed, and not one of them reappears in Genesis. But then we get this concluding summary in verse 5. From these, the coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans, and in their nations. And as quickly as Japheth is introduced, we're done with him. Ham is next, and his section starts in verse 6. Unlike Japheth's descendants, Ham's are a bit more recognizable, and there are 30 of them. If you've read much of the First Testament, you immediately recognize both Egypt and Canaan as major players throughout Israel's story. Some of the place names, Babel and Assyria and Nineveh, these are going to reappear in the story, and so these become familiar. We get to the end of Ham's section, which reveals a developing pattern. Look in verse 20. These are the sons of Ham, by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. This sounds just like the end of Japheth's section. Almost. The summaries are in different orders, and Japheth's descendants are described as spreading in their lands. But Ham's descendants are merely identified with their lands. Except in the middle of this genealogy, in verse 18, there is a note that afterward the clans of the Canaanites dispersed. A spreading, perhaps. Shem's section, then, is the third one. And there's also this concluding summary. So in verse 31, you see, like Ham's summary, there's nothing said about spreading into lands. These are the sons of Shem by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. Nothing about spreading into lands. But again, within this genealogy, there's a comment about the earth being divided. Each of these words, spread, dispersed, divided, seem like they could be related, but at this point we don't have much by way of real clues as to what's going on and why this might be important, why they might be important to the story. Shem's got 26 descendants, beginning in verse 21, and his list includes a few additional recognizable names, but there is one that's noteworthy, especially noteworthy. Shem is said to be the father of all of the children of Eber. Eber appears to be the origin of the name Hebrew. That comes to be the term that the nations will use to speak of God's chosen people, the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham. So scholars generally agree that when you add up all of the total number of descendants, the list totals 70. And so here we are at the end of the beginning section of Genesis, and there are 70 nations. When we get to the very end of Genesis is preparing to close. We hear that the chosen people of God, the descendants of Shem, the descendants of Abraham, have become their very own family of 70 people. There's a question that runs through Genesis and throughout much of the Bible. And it has to do with the connection between these nations and the chosen nation. And here we find some clues that they are linked from the very beginning in some sort of profound way. Let's look at verse 32 then, the conclusion of this genealogy. In verse 32 we read, "These are the clans of the sons of Noah, according to their generations in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood." This is our final summary, the conclusion. And at a basic level, all it's doing, right, is repeating the introduction that we already heard at the beginning. We're reminded that this is the genealogy of the sons of Noah. And with regard to time, we're reminded again that these are the people that were born after the flood. This is the new humanity that God is filling the new earth with. And so we take note of who these people are, but we also notice what they are doing here in verse 32. They have spread abroad on the earth. They've spread abroad on the earth. This might sound like an insignificant detail, easy to just pass over and move on, except this phrase continues to ring out from the very beginning of creation and the very first time God spoke to human creatures that he had made. God blessed those first human beings and he said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Just a couple chapters later, we're reminded that when God created these humans, he blessed them. And we're told that Adam and Eve have begun this fruitfulness, multiplying effort. They've parented sons and daughters generation after generation. Humans have been fruitful. But then chapter 6 opens up and announces that humans have begun to multiply on the face of the ground. We're not told the earth, the ground. It seems hopeful, like it might be moving there. That is until we learn back in chapter 6, you might remember this, that what humans had been filling the ground with was not a God-blessed humanity bearing the image of God, but rather a God-alienated humanity bearing only violent wickedness. We learned in verse 6 that the earth was filled with violence and the wickedness of humanity. As Derek said last week, Noah wasn't then just another start. He was a complete restart. When the flood then had finished and Noah and his family, they leave the ark, God blesses Noah and his sons just as he had Adam and Eve. And he says to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." The same words that Adam and Eve received. When we read the conclusion then of this genealogy here in chapter 10, it should surprise us a little bit. The first 9 chapters of Genesis, they don't give us much of a reason to trust human beings. At every turn, we're left wondering whether humanity can ever overcome their tendencies toward rebellion. Along the way, we get a couple individuals. We get Enoch and we get Noah, who are said to walk with God, but they really seem to be the exceptions to the rule. Until this list of the sons of Noah's sons. Noah's sons have clearly been busy. They've been busy being fruitful and multiplying, but we've heard all that before. Which is why the final verse of chapter 10 is so surprising. The sons of Noah's sons have spread across the earth, filling it. Something truly has changed after the flood. Humans appear to be on their way to fulfilling God's creation intentions. This is good news. The sons of Noah's sons are filling the earth, all of them. And so you can see how more than just a static list of names, you can see how being more than just a static list of names, this genealogy moves the story forward by demonstrating that God's good creation can and it will move towards God's purposes. This is an exciting turn in the narrative in Genesis. It is a hopeful chapter right here at the beginning of Genesis. And so as any good story does, we're now compelled to keep reading, wondering what will happen to these nations. Turn then to chapter 11, the next verse. So just scan the next verse down. We hear it open this way. Now, the whole earth had one language and the same words. Something's off here, right? We were told that Japheth's sons had their own languages and Ham's son had their own languages, and Shem's sons had their own languages, but the whole earth has one language. The author of Genesis has pulled off an epic plot jump. Having told the story of the nations, spreading out and filling the earth, we now jump back in time. This story that follows then takes place after the flood, but before the sons of Noah have spread abroad on the earth. So we've been given the big picture and we've jumped back to see how this unfolds. Look with me then at chapter 11, verse 9. The final verse of the story. And we read, "There the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth." Just by reading the first and the last verses, we can get a sense of the basic plot line, right? After the flood, Noah's sons have children. Everyone speaks the same language until one day the Lord causes the language to be confused, and the Lord then disperses and spreads the people over the face of the earth. We notice the similarities between keywords in this passage and the genealogy that we just looked at. Words like language, the earth, and dispersed or spread. They link these passages together. These links then, they give us this creative story. Chapter 10 announces, matter-of-factly, that the sons of Noah's sons spread over the earth. Earlier in the story of Noah, we saw this same kind of behavior. The Lord spoke to Noah, and Noah did exactly as the Lord commanded. And we're left with this similar impression now of what's going on. The Lord commanded Noah and his sons to be fruitful, to multiply, and to fill the earth. And the sons of Noah's sons did what the Lord commanded. But chapter 11 suggests that there is more to this story. Chapters earlier, God commands his people to fill the earth. Chapter 10 tells us that this has happened. But chapter 11 here tells us how that happened. In verse 4, here in chapter 11, we then read, we learn what these humans are up to. We find here a people that are reluctant to obey God's commands. And we read, the people said, "Come," said this to each other, "let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." This group of people have said, let's huddle together. We need to stick together to keep from being spread out over the earth. We don't know their motivation, really. Whatever their motivation, what they intend to do is they intend to avoid obeying God's command. Or perhaps they are resisting God's command. So whatever their motivation, right? They either intend to avoid obeying God, or they just intend to resist obeying God. I think this story is a little bit of an awkward one for the American church. For several decades now, the church in America has been driven by some impulses that seem to have resonance with the people in this story. If you examine the American church's pattern over the last 50 years, you could sort of hear this rallying cry, can't you? Come, let us gather together here, and let's get as many people who are just like us to gather with us. And then let's build big and impressive buildings to make a name for ourselves, lest we are sent to make disciples of all nations. Surveys have long indicated that the large percentage of Americans who profess Christian faith have very few reservations, self-reporting that they're not engaged in making disciples. Disciple making is the work of the church. The church, the people that God is sending into the world. Filling the earth with disciples of Jesus is the church's call. But if we're honest, Christians are highly capable at avoiding and resisting obedience in this matter. And so this story stands as a warning to us, because it is far too easy to take over God's voice. We recall God's voice in creation. Let us make. Here the people adopt God's voice. They use this phrase for themselves as a call to initiate their own creative efforts disconnected from the God who made them. And you know, it's far too easy to use our creative, God-given abilities to avoid God, to justify our lack of obedience, to even oppose or resist God. But there is way more to this passage than just human failure, because we also have God's response. For the very first time since God flooded the earth, we see God respond to human sin. And we recall God's promise, God's covenant. But we have yet to see, okay, so what does it look like for God to deal with human rebellion? How is he going to do this now? We remember earlier when he hung up his warrior's bow in the sky, but maybe he has another weapon like hidden in his back or in his sock or something. What will God do to us now? And we find God's response at the very center, the very heart of the story. And the Lord God, or the Lord, came down. The Lord came down. It would seem that our observation earlier was right. Something truly has changed since the flood, but the change is with God. God comes down and God intervenes, and God is able to keep his new creation project moving in the right direction. God remains faithful to his covenant promise, while at the same time he demonstrates his ability to disperse resistant nations. In the chapters to come, we're going to find a story of God, a God who is able to direct a single man. We're going to hear stories about a God who is then able to direct a larger family. Eventually, we'll hear what it's like for God to direct a nation. But on our way through this story, we must not forget that the God who chooses Abraham, the God who preserves Jacob's sons, who calls Israel, is the same God who is able to fill the earth with reluctant nations. The God of the nations, Israel's God, is the God who comes down. This will be one of the characteristic ways the Bible talks about God's relationship with his creation. He is the God who comes near. He is God with us. It should be noted that while God with us is often heard by us as a comforting promise, throughout Israel's history, the promise that God comes down was not just a hope-filled promise, but it was also a warning. God's nearness can be experienced as comfort, but it can also be quite painfully experienced as scattering. Churches close down every day across America. This has been consistent for some period of time. And there are some who see this as a sign of the devil's work or something going on here. And I can't speak for every situation, but you know, honestly, I don't have a problem seeing this as God's work. If people are going to be busy building reputable churches as a way to avoid being sent to make disciples, the God who comes down can certainly scatter his churches as he has the nations who hid behind their city building. I want to conclude by making an observation. 2 weeks in a row now, we've encountered God accomplishing his intentions. Last week, God did so through Noah. This week, he does so through the nations. In Noah's story, God spoke and Noah obeyed. God starts creation over through Noah's obedience. In the story of the nations, God speaks and the nations resist. God fills the earth anyway. He does so in spite of the nations. His response isn't to destroy them, however, but to graciously help them along. One of the important questions that we, I think, learn to ask of biblical stories and then our own lives is this. As we look around, are God's intentions being fulfilled because of human obedience? Or is God bringing about his purposes in spite of human resistance? I'll ask that question again. I think this is probably one worth writing down. Are God's intentions being fulfilled because of human obedience? Or is God bringing about his purposes in spite of human resistance? There are two constants in this. One, God is able to move creation toward its purpose. And second, God intends to use us to do this. Will we go where he sends us, or will we stand in the way?